Crowds continue to gather around the world in solidarity against police brutality in the United States. The demonstrations have been in response to the uproar following the death of African American man George Floyd under the knee of a white police officer. To discuss now, we're joined by Nick Harper in Washington. Nick, tell us where you are and what's happening in your neck of the woods.
Well, we've seen a huge number of people out on the streets during the course of this morning. It's about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and we're expecting this protest to be continuing throughout the day into the evening. There has been a number of different marches. We're outside of the White House, and a few minutes ago a huge march came along this way. Around the city there are various staging points, various different marches. Protesters have asked for 1 million people to be out on the streets this Saturday. That would be the largest protest so far in Washington, D.C. And we're also seeing other protests around the country. Big numbers of people gathering in Los Angeles, San Francisco and New York as well. It is expected to be a very, very big day of protest. That anger that we've seen for almost 2 weeks, about 12 consecutive days of protest, is really now pushing its way towards action. And many of the protesters are asking for police reform, for there to be substantial changes about the way that police officers arrest and detain citizens, because obviously all of this being sparked by the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis when the police officer knelt on his neck. Minneapolis have now changed their rules. They're saying that that chokehold will not be used, but protesters say that those type of changes are needed right across the United States.
So, like you said, this has been going on for 11, 12 days. Is the energy actually rising rather than sort of falling as these protests go on?
I think the energy has changed in many ways. Having been covering these during this time, we have seen that initial visceral anger and outrage which really surged right across the United States. It has calmed a little bit. For example, here today, it's a Saturday. It's much more of a family atmosphere. We have speeches, we have music. It's almost a celebration in some respects. But underneath all of that, there is that real push for police reform. People are still angry, they're still outraged, but they are pushing for changes, and they're turning that anger to action. So I think we're not really seeing a diminishment of the type of sentiment for people. A few protesters who we spoke to a few moments ago before we came on air, they were quite simply saying that enough is enough. They've seen this level of police brutality in the past, they've seen protests in the past, but this time round they really want all of this to matter and to actually affect real change across the United States.
And certainly the atmosphere behind you seems very different than the other day when we know tear gas was used. Just tell us about what you're seeing in the interactions between demonstrators and police at the moment.
Yeah, it has been very different, and that, I guess, has changed during time. I mean, a few days ago when I was down here, protesters were rattling that fence behind me, that special 8-foot security fence put up by police officers. The police officers were just behind, all in their riot gear. It is a calmer atmosphere today. On another occasion, we had police officers this far apart from protesters, the police officers dressed in full riot gear, the protesters shouting in their faces. So it has certainly been something of a change. We haven't had the level of arrests that we saw initially. That has died down, much fewer arrests over the last few nights. And the firing of tear gas also hasn't happened over the last few nights, here in Washington, D.C. at least. There does seem to be that calmer approach from both sides, you might say.
Which is good news, but elsewhere there have been excesses on both sides. We know an elderly activist pushed down and many officers in Buffalo now apparently are protesting after 2 police officers were charged. Nick, surely that doesn't bode well for relationships between the demonstrators and the police.
No, certainly not, and that's what protesters have been saying, that police have used police brutality at protests that are all about police brutality, that they've used that force on protesters when those protesters are, in many cases, acting in a peaceful manner. That incident that you mentioned in Buffalo, a man who was 75 being videoed pushed to the ground by two police officers. He seemed to hit his head and there seemed to be blood pouring out of his ear. Those two police officers were suspended without pay. They've now been charged with assault. But we've also seen a reaction from that police force. The other 57 members of that police unit resigned from the tactical unit. They didn't resign from the police force itself, but resigning in protest and in solidarity to what was happening to the police. But protesters are saying that we're seeing those type of incidents videoed and released on social media and creating those viral moments, the type of incidents that they say really should not be happening at any time, but certainly shouldn't be happening at these protests and at these marches that are all about the way that police officers are treating civilians.
Yeah, incredible scenes. What about concerns around the spread of the coronavirus right now? Of course, there's an incredible infection rate already in the US. What are authorities saying? I do see behind you that a lot of those demonstrators are wearing masks.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, if you have a little look behind me, you can see that there are a lot of people wearing masks. The vast majority, I would say, are out here in masks. But there has been that concern, not just here in the US, but in other countries. We heard calls in the United Kingdom for protesters either not to go out or not to get too close to each other, which, as you can see from the scene behind me, is incredibly difficult. You just cannot enforce that 6 feet or 2 meter rule in these tightly packed situations. But of course that raises fears and concerns from epidemiologists who are looking at all of this and saying that potentially in a week or two's time from now we could see a spike in new infections, especially in these big city urban areas where many of the protests are taking place.
Nick, let's end off with responses, maybe from the protesters themselves to President Donald Trump the other day, saying in a strange context that it was a great day for George Floyd.
Yeah, an incredible moment that. Donald Trump at the White House giving a press conference to talk about the job numbers, where we saw a couple of million people gaining jobs within the last few months. But he said that George Floyd was looking down, thinking that this was a great moment. Now, Donald Trump supporters have tried to clarify his comments. They're saying that Donald Trump was not saying that George Floyd thought that the job numbers were good, but rather that Donald Trump was speaking in the context of equal treatment. And Donald Trump was saying that George Floyd would look at all of this and think that it was a great moment, that people were out on the streets protesting it. But of course, there was a huge backlash against Donald Trump for those type of comments. Joe Biden, the man who President Trump will be squaring off against in November's election, the Democrat candidate, said it was despicable for him to even use the word, the memory and name of George Floyd in such a.
All right, losing the sound there, but thank you for that update live from Washington, D.C. That was Nick Harper.